Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Mary Bichetti, and I'm the Director of Alumni and Constituent Relations for CFANS. Welcome to the 2023 Classes Without Quizzes program. This program was established by the Alumni Society in 2002 as a way to keep alumni and friends connected to the college and to highlight the new and exciting, impactful research that's done by our faculty. Over the 20 plus years, more than 1,100 alumni and friends have joined in this learning adventure, with many attending multiple years on the St. Paul campus. We're thankful that we've been able to continue the program virtually since 2020. And now it's my pleasure to turn the program over to the MC for the day, our Alumni Board past president and chair of the Program Planning Committee, Annie Makepeace.
Thanks, Mary. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. As Mary said, my name is Annie Makepeace. I received my MS degree from CFANS in Applied Plant Science in 2015, and then joined the workforce and quickly began serving on the CFANS Alumni Society Board from 2016 to 2022. So this has always been one of my favorite programs, and I continue to serve as the chair for Classes Without Quizzes, even as my time on the board has come to a close. So this program is one way we bring to life the board's mission to foster relationships that benefit our college alumni, students, and friends by sharing with all of you guys some of the really great, awesome, and important research that's going on within CFANS. So we really hope you enjoy the program. We're excited to welcome you to Finding Balance, Healthy Farms, Healthy Planet, where we're highlighting work that's done by the Agricultural Research, Education, and Extension Tech Transfer Program, or AGREET for short. We'll start with an introduction from two of our U of M deans that have ties to AGREET. And after that, we will have three lightning presentations from three of our AGREET faculty members from across the college, Lindsay Pease, Erin Cortus, and Kim VanderWaal. So we encourage you to add your questions to the chat during the presentations to kind of keep the flow going, but we'll save Q&A for the end. I will moderate a brief Q&A at the end of the presentations after the speakers finish. And at the end, after that, after the Q&A, you'll have the option to interact with our faculty presenters in breakout rooms for more engagement and questions if you choose. So those rooms will be open for 10 to 15 minutes after the program closes, and you'll be able to move from room to room if you would like. So it's now my pleasure to welcome Milena Saki-Salces, the Interim Associate Dean for Research and Grad Programs, and Jolene Hadrich, the Interim Associate Dean for the Minnesota Ag Experiment Station and CFANS Research and Outreach Centers, to provide us with an introduction.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Can everybody see my screen? Can I get thumbs up? Yes, thank you. So today we're talking about finding balance and involving healthy farms and a healthy planet. The first thing I wanted to go through is getting a refresher on CFANS. So everybody probably here knows that CFANS is the College of Food, Agricultural, and Natural Resource Sciences in the University of Minnesota, but not everybody remembers how complex CFANS is and how it involves a lot more than just classrooms and some buildings in the St. Paul campus. So CFANS is actually 4 complete different entities together. One is our St. Paul campus facilities that have our research and instruction buildings and rooms, in our agricultural experimental station fields and spaces for research. We have the ARB, that is part of CFANS. We have the Bell Museum that last year was celebrating its 150th anniversary. And we are also have 10 research and outreach centers that are distributed across the state. And that is what allows us to reach out to all Minnesotans in terms of our functions as educators and researchers in sharing the mission of the college and the university. So to our last count, we had 1,840 students in 14 undergraduate programs, 622 graduate students in 13 graduate programs, 247 faculty, and adding, we have like 7 more coming in, and 785 staff with about 30,000 alumni and counting. So Mary probably has a better number for me than that. Nope, that's a good number. And overall, CFANS has more than 25 centers that are either constituted by groups of our faculty and researchers inside and collaborate with others, or that there are centers that have been created outside where our faculty are working. So why am I bringing all this now, and why is this important? Well, because we are working on a principle that is beyond us, and it has to do a lot with how do we integrate our function and our work with the rest of the world. So there's a principle that is being introduced as One Health. One Health is this idea that every single thing that we do as humans affects the rest of the world. So One Health evaluates or considers how the environment, the humans, the animals, and every single activity we have at the end of the day comes back in the big circle and affects other areas. So by maintaining clear communication, collaboration, coordination, and capacity building, what we can do is generate healthy ecosystems, healthy animals, and healthy humans in a way that everybody works together. This principle is very, very important because with the AGREET program that Jolene is going to be explaining to you is actually what it's trying to do. What they're trying to do, or what we're trying to do, is finding this balance between our healthy farms and our healthy environment and our healthy humans, and at the end of the day, a healthy world for us to live. And I'm going to leave Jolene to continue here.
Okay. So many of you on the call might know what AGREET is, but we felt it was important to just remind everyone where we started close to 8 years ago. So in 2015, Minnesota lawmakers approved legislation that allowed the U of M, in particular CFANS, the College of Vet Med, and the College of Extension, to have a $5 million state investment in agricultural research. And this agricultural research was focused in a way to make sure that it was integrated, but also that it was reaching a broader audience. So how are these funds used? Well, once the money got infused into those 3 colleges, they really emphasized that the decision about what the priorities for the state were in the agricultural sphere of research needed to be determined by a broad group of people, because we didn't want one individual to identify what the focus was. We really wanted to emphasize what that integrated approach is. So there is an advisory panel of agricultural industry representatives that meet on an annual or sometimes semi-annual basis to identify what are the research priorities for the state as a whole, and how can we make sure that we have the AGREET positions available to answer those questions. And those questions that we're trying to answer are, what are those critical challenges that we see agriculture in Minnesota facing in the near term, but also how can we identify what we're doing in the near term to impact our long-term viability as well. AGREET is not just impacting faculty members, but it also hires research faculty, extension regional educators, as well as there are some funding for graduate students. You're fine, Milena, I got it memorized. So full disclosure, when I moved back to Minnesota in 2017, I was an AGREET faculty member. Now I'm in the dean's office, but I've lived this program, so I'm pretty well acquainted with it. So as I've indicated, how does AGREET specifically help Minnesota farmers? Well, having this infusion of funds allowed us to refocus our efforts within those 3 colleges on questions that were relevant to our stakeholders. And I want to emphasize that our stakeholders, are broad in the fact that, we're looking at farmers, but farmers not just in one specific area, but across the system. And we'll talk about those advancements in a moment. but it allows our research faculty and extension professionals to interact with these stakeholders to help us solve questions that are relevant at this point in time. And that feeds into the next point, that AGREET helps all Minnesotans. You know, we recognize that the food economy, our natural resource systems, like Milena mentioned, are all intertwined. And AGREET allows us to, you know, tap into those specific areas that impact those systems and better identify ways to move forward in that whole One Health initiative. So what are our AGREET faculty doing? So we've been able to hire over 30 faculty since 2017. And for these 3 colleges, that was something that was really valuable because each of them had faced different budget constraints previously to that point in time. So having this infusion of talent, knowledge, expertise has really allowed us to recruit some top faculty, research, extension people. So what are they doing? So we could have a very long laundry list. I think Milena might still have that slide. You can quick hop to that and come back. But
I deleted it.
He deleted it. It's a paragraph that fills this whole slide of all the different research and outreach and extension that we've done. But these infographics help tell that story really well. You know, we have a lot of livestock systems looking at poultry, beef, dairy, specialty markets that we're looking at. We also have a lot of fruit and vegetable production that we're looking at within AGREET. Weather changing patterns are something that we always are focusing on. We recognize that Minnesota is a diverse state, so the weather that we might have in southern Minnesota is very different than northern Minnesota. And how can our research help to navigate those changes? Wildlife, a big component. Most people I know have cabins in northern Minnesota, so making sure that those resources remain available, connecting with our forestry department as well as some of our wilderness research areas is really important within the AGREET program. And then those last 3 you know, infographics really show about how we're pulling that system together, looking at breeding new plants that help us address some of the items we identify early on. But again, how do those new plants help our system? You know, we have done a number of projects looking at tick-borne illnesses, antimicrobial resistance, the microbiome. I could really spit out any word that you've heard on any television program or news release, and we could connect it to something we've done at CFANS. So not all of it is just AGREET. We're a much bigger system than that within CFANS and CVM and extension, but it sort of gives you the breadth and the depth of what we work on. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our MC to introduce our 3 amazing faculty who are going to talk about their work in action.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for sharing some more about CFANS and AGREET and their impact at the university and state levels and actually beyond to support all Minnesotans in that One Health initiative. So yes, next we look forward to hearing from Lindsay Pease. She's an assistant professor and extension specialist in soil, water, and climate. So thank you, Lindsay, for joining us today.
Yes, hello. And thanks for having me. I am really excited to sort of kick off this discussion. And my talk today is just a really brief look at the different nutrient and water management programs that I am looking into. And I am actually in the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate, as Annie said, but I am really unique in that I am stationed at one of those outstate research and outreach centers that Milena and Jolene just mentioned. I am at the Northwest Research and Outreach Center, all the way, 5 hours north of most of you in Crookston. And my main charge here and working with farmers up here, I am working on adapting conservation practices to fit the unique challenges of farming in northern Minnesota. We have a lot of, just that little bit colder climate than the rest of the state, but we're also dealing with really different systems. The one picture that's on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen is a picture of, a farm field just after all of our spring flooding events, which, actually this year, so far, the flooding's not looking too bad, but this was from last year. And you can just see the volume of soil that moves when we have all of this snowmelt runoff moving across the landscape. So there's a big piece of my job, which is figuring out how do we make conservation systems work. But because not everything that works further south in Minnesota is going to work when we have wheat and when we have sugar beets in the rotation. And so then the picture on the bottom right-hand side of the screen is part of a grant that we have to actually look at, can we interseed cover crops? Can we plant a crop while sugar beets are growing and then have that live through the winter? That's the goal. Still working on it a little bit, but we are trying all sorts of crazy things. And it's been really fun to, get a chance to highlight this work in this region of the state, even nationally and internationally. One of the really big events that was super exciting that happened last summer was I got to host a bunch of researchers at the Northwest Research and Outreach Center. I got people to come to Crookston from Canada and from the UK and gave them a field tour. And got to teach them about, sugar beets and nutrient and water management. And really all of this is to improve pathways for fertilizer use efficiency. And that really helps the farmers, but it also has that combined benefit of helping the environment. Anything we can keep on the landscape is great for the farmer because they want to keep it for their farms and their profitability, but it also means that we're not losing it elsewhere. Just to dig a little bit deeper into one of the projects, one thing you may not know is the Northwest Research and Outreach Center has the coolest drainage plots in the entire country, by annual average temperature. I installed this drainage system back in 2019. And we're really digging into that question of where nutrients are moving. And we've made a huge change in the system by installing subsurface drainage systems. And we really want to understand how that change is affecting the system. And, we've already had a big impact. We've had 2 graduate students in CFANS graduate just in the last year. And we've had a bunch of field tours in. And one of the reasons they're doing subsurface drainage research all the way up north, I can show you in one picture why this field needed drainage. This field was after wheat harvest when we were going to install the drainage system. And actually this field was too wet to even install the drainage system. So this was a really late and delayed process. And some of the things we are looking at in this field are obviously we're looking at water quality monitoring and what's coming off the field, but we're not only looking at what's coming off the field. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but I do know that the slides are going to be shared with you, so you can dig into this later if you so choose. But I have been talking with farmers a lot about the nitrogen cycle and about chemistry. I've actually shared this picture in some of my extension talks and walked farmers through the actual processes that are happening. And in the spirit of classes without quizzes, I thought I at least needed to show this to all of you today. And the 3 pieces that we're measuring that leaching piece that you see in the bottom center of the screen. We're also looking at the denitrification piece. Those are greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot of microbes in the soil, and they also release a small but potentially impactful amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So we are measuring those. And we're also looking at yields. We've had 2 or 3 very different years. Every year is different. And so we're looking at, does drainage help in a wet year? Does it help in a dry year? So far, it's been a little bit of a toss-up. You can see how patchy the soybeans were in 2020. That was because we were underwater for most of the year. 2021 was the exact opposite. We were so dry that you could see the soils cracking. And so we saw a real benefit of drainage in 2020 when it was wet. In a dry year, both plots were equally dry. So no benefit, but also no penalty of drainage in 2021. So just to kind of summarize, we do see undrained plots. They have an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So we're actually seeing a benefit to greenhouse gases with drainage installation. Uptake through yields, it's kind of a toss-up, depends on what kind of a year you have. Obviously, nitrogen loss in water is a little bit higher because you're installing subsurface drainage. But overall, it kind of depends what your goals are. I mean, if the goals are greenhouse gas emissions, then the drainage is really positive. If the goals are yield, it's really positive. Nitrogen loss in water requires a little bit more finesse, and you may have to deal with those problems if you're in a highly impacted watershed. And that's also, just to kind of bring this back around, what some of the other additional projects we're working on is then how do we address this potential water quality impact that we're having that has benefits in other places? How do we address those trade-offs? So with that, I know there's a lot of information for you in a short amount of time, but I'm happy to discuss that at the end, and I'll pass this back over to Annie.
Awesome. Thank you, Lindsay. Thanks for sharing some of your work in nutrient water management. Excited to hear what questions people might have for you. Reminder that you can put those in the chat and we will address those at the end of the program if you have stuff that's timely, kind of at the top of your mind right now after Lindsay's. So next we're going to hear from Erin Cortus. She's an associate professor and extension engineer in the bioproducts and biosystems engineering.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it. I'm in the AGREET position for Sustainable Animal Agriculture Systems. I'm in the Bioproducts and Biosystems Engineering Department, and I was hired in a position that is extension and research, and then there is some teaching involved in there through advising of grad students, and then some other teaching assignments as well. But in the vein of what Lindsay started, and since this is classes without quizzes, I did have I thought I better share, some content related to the science of engineering. So what I wanted to share is a closed loop system. A closed loop system is where the outputs from a system are determined in part by responses of the system. So a good example of this is your heating or cooling system, depending on the day, in a building. So in a building, you set a desired temperature, you manipulate the system through a set point, or tell the controller what you want. The system responds by turning on the heat, for example, and then that produces heat in the room to warm it up. But then you have this thermostat in a room that checks that temperature, and that temperature that it senses, it sends it back to the system. It becomes another input to the system. And so you have this combination of the system itself, how the system is responding, the temperature of the room, and what you want, guiding what comes out of it. This closed loop system is a pretty prominent feature in engineering education, but I also think it speaks highly to what we do in our roles in CFANS, what I do in my role in this AGREET position. So in my position, I use local extension teaching and research resources, some that I've developed myself, some that come from others in the area. We put that into a system, some sort of calculator, some sort of technology that influences an industry. And in my case, that's usually a livestock industry. It could be poultry, beef, dairy, swine. And then what comes out of that? Well, what comes out of that is the livestock system can be products, but it can also be emissions. It can be an environmental impact, and it can be cost as well. But where this type of position, this type of AGREET position, and this type of incorporation of extension with research comes in is that we have this feedback built in. We have this feedback from stakeholders in the community, whether it's farms or the general public, that circle back so that we can inform the system by the system itself and ultimately lead to impact. So what I wanted to highlight was a project that I've been working on over the past year, which is building capacity to support Midwest dairy sustainability initiatives. And it's sponsored by the Midwest Dairy, and the idea is how can we build this capacity within the dairy industry in the Midwest region? How can we support dairy farms and those who support the dairy industry to be part of this growing effort? One of the questions that I receive during every single meeting, every single presentation I've done on this topic is, how do you define sustainability? The approach that I've taken in describing sustainability is likening it to a long distance road trip. And that's not necessarily the definition of sustainability itself, but it's a recognition that we all as individuals, as organizations, as companies have different end goals for what that might look like. And so rather than putting a definition on it based on my own interpretation, what I find it helps is to understand how has the person, the organization, the group I'm working with defined it. What are their plans for how to get there? And then what are they doing to implement it? Now, not everybody is already at the implementation stage, but recognizing that it's a road trip for everyone, that's been my approach in this project. And why are we doing this? Well, the US dairy industry has made a collective commitment to achieve greenhouse gas neutrality, optimize water use by maximizing recycling and improving water quality. The swine industry, the poultry industries, and the other livestock commodities, as well as grain commodities, have made commitments as well. And so this work spans across the gamut, but I'm focusing on dairy today. But there is this collective commitment, but how do we bring everybody along in this? Recognizing not everybody needs to achieve all three goals necessarily, but how can we as industries and as those who support these livestock industries help the industry as a whole reach these goals? One of the most impactful slides in my experience this past year has been this depiction from US Dairy about, well, where does the carbon footprint come from on a farm? Part of this conversation opens our eyes, opens our perspective to what contributes to a carbon footprint, what contributes to these conversations about sustainability. And it goes beyond what just happens in the barn. It goes beyond the animals. It includes the feed production, it includes the manure management, and includes the energy production. But where should we be focusing our efforts? There isn't one answer by any means. But there are different impacts if we focus on the feed production, the enteric methane reduction, on-farm energy use, or the manure handling. But even within those, not every farm has the same options available to them. Not every region has the same options available to them. And so how do we build up this suite of solutions, or this suite of actions, I should say, to help us move towards this, help us move as an industry towards these goals? Most importantly, what I've learned through this past year is that these conversations are deeply personal. When speaking at different dairy meetings across the state and region, these are some of the frequently asked questions that have come up. Why is dairy under the spotlight for greenhouse gas reductions? And my farm has been around for a century. Doesn't that exemplify sustainability? Like, what else do we need to do? And so this project that I've been working on is about navigating these conversations so that we can be a part of them. Not necessarily jumping to implementing actions, but let's just at least be part of these conversations from the dairy side, and also informing that general public side. How can we be part of these conversations so that we move together? And so that's leading into this coming year's work, which is building value in baselines. Baselines are just one type of metric that we can use for uncovering what is going on in a system, setting some quantitative data for where we can move. But the idea that we're focusing on this year is, well, we have these baselines. How do we move it into the regular mainstream conversation and encourage repetition? And that's going to be answering this so what, now what, when we have a baseline. With that, I'll turn it back to Annie.
Thank you. Thanks, Erin, for sharing a brief snapshot of your work in supporting the sustainable dairy production. So next, we'd like to welcome our final speaker, Kim VanderWaal. She's the Associate Professor and Extension Faculty in Veterinary Population Medicine. Thanks, Kim, for joining us today.
You're welcome. All right, well, thank you so much for inviting me here today. And today we're going to switch gears, or now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about infectious diseases in livestock populations, which is the area I work in. But I thought I'd first give you a little context of who I am, because I actually am a Minnesota native. I grew up in Bloomington, and I'm also an alumni of the university. So I did my undergraduate here, graduated in 2007. From the College of Biological Sciences. So here's a picture of me in 2007 in front of Northrop Auditorium. And Then I left for a while, did my PhD in California, and then in 2017, I was lucky enough to be hired back in Minnesota so I could work at my alma mater. And now I live in Columbia Heights with my daughter and my dog Cisco. So, all right, so what we're going to talk about now is a virus that infects pigs, which is called porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome virus. And this is a virus that is probably, and I say probably, it probably is the most important constraint from a health standpoint to production of swine in the U.S. And part of the reason for that is it is a disease that has massive clinical impacts on pigs, but it's also very prevalent. So around 30 to 50% of breeding farms in the US have active circulation of this particular virus, which we refer to as PRRS. And it results in productivity losses in the US of upwards of $600 million per year, which is often cited, but it's probably an underestimate. But to break that down, what does that actually mean? If we look at what that means in terms of the number of pigs that we actually produce as a US swine industry per year, the presence of PRRS in the industry leads to about a reduction of over 9 million pigs produced per year. So that's, I think, how I can link to the theme today, which is the healthy farms, healthy planet, because now we are having to produce all these, excess pigs that actually never get to market. They never become pork. And so if we were able to better manage some of these diseases that infect pigs, we could probably produce the same amount of pork as we currently do, but with, fewer pigs, and then ultimately, potentially fewer farms and less overall impact. And then putting that on the basis of what does PRRS mean for an individual farmer or producer? This dollar figure that I cite translates to about $50 per sow per year. And if you translate that to the average size of a sow farm in the US, that would translate to about $150,000 per year on average. So very costly disease on an individual producer level. Now, PRRS is interesting because it's probably one of the most sequenced viruses in the world. And it's very unique in that the sequence data, so this is, actually looking at the genome of the virus and generating the genetic sequence. The motivation to that is driven by the actual producer and the veterinarians that are treating these pigs. And they use sequencing as a tool to, basically make disease management decisions. And that's not true for many viruses. I would say for human viruses, yes, we do some sequencing, but sequencing the virus is generally not part of our day-to-day management of, a case of the flu or even for SARS-CoV-2. We do a lot of sequencing for that, but not for individual disease management. But this is true for PRRS in pigs. And primarily why sequencing is being done is that a producer or a veterinarian has, say, a new strain on their farm, or they have new disease on their farm, and they want to know, well, is the strain I have today the same as the strain I had last year? Or is it a new introduction? Or maybe if they, have strain A, they want to know where it came from so they can, compare their virus to maybe viruses of their neighbors or other farms in the area and try to figure out, where did it come from and how can we prevent this hopefully from happening in the future? So all of this has generated an enormous amount of sequence data. And this data can be very useful for understanding the epidemiology of the disease, because if you can imagine, if you're infected by a virus, each time that virus replicates within a host, there's a chance that mutations occur. So if you have two viruses, say two PRRS viruses, collected from two different hosts, you can actually look at how many genetic changes have occurred. And the more changes there are between those two viruses, the less likely you would say that those cases have some sort of epidemiological linkage, or that they're part of, the same chain of transmission. So the genetic relatedness of the pathogen can tell us something about where, when, and how different viruses are spreading. And it also can tell us how a virus might be adapting. And so this collectively is called the field of molecular epidemiology, which is the area I work, and I use this to try to understand PRRS. So if you can contextualize PRRS genetic variation, we have PRRS evolution going on all the time. There's a number of different evolutionary processes that generate genetic change in the virus. But the implications, or how we try to use these data, is for potentially outbreak investigation. Again, this is the where did the virus come from that gets introduced to my farm? We can also step back at a more regional perspective and try to track the spread of our current, genetic variants that we have, or, try to track the emerging new variants that might be evolving in an area and try to see how they're spreading. And then we know that as the virus changes genetically, then there's a chance that the virus will no longer be recognized in the same way by the host immunity, right? So this is the idea that if I'm infected with strain A, and then I later get infected with strain B, does the immunity that I already have because I was exposed to strain A, is that going to protect me from having, a bad case of this disease when I get infected by strain B? And so for all of these, we need to be able to define genetic variants of the virus. So we can use SARS-CoV-2 as a familiar example here. The World Health Organization actually defined a number of variants, the Delta variant, Omicron variant. All those are basically genetic variants that we're trying to use to bin the virus into some sort of meaningful group that we can then analyze. And so we have tried to do this for PRRS. We use what's called a lineage-based classification system, which was developed in 2010, which basically tries to group the viruses into these ancestral viral families based on their genetic relatedness. We can visualize this in a tree. However, when this original lineage-based system was developed in 2010, they only defined 9 lineages. And if you look at the occurrence of those lineages across time in our large-scale data sets that we have for PRRS, we see that the vast majority of the viruses all belong to lineage 1 in the US, which is not very useful if all the viruses are being called the same thing. So one of the first things that we did, and this was basically very soon after I was hired as an AGREET faculty member, is to actually stratify this lineage 1 into multiple sublineages to make them into more useful groups. We can look at this in a different way and look at the effective or the estimated population size of these different sublineages through time. And now we can start to see some very interesting patterns where we see kind of the repeated emergence of new sublineages through time. And then each of those increases kind of like with a wave-like crest. And then we get a peak and then a sequential turnover in whatever this dominant sublineage is that's circulating in the industry. So we can now start to quantify those patterns and see that we see a remarkable consistency in which these emergence events are occurring. So we see that there's essentially a new dominant lineage or sublineage every 3 years, and that's remarkably clock-like. We can trace this every 3-year cycle all the way back to 1998, and that 3-year cycle has been pretty much ongoing since then. And that we see generally from the year from we first detect a new sublineage to when it becomes the dominant one is more around 4 to 5 years. So this starts to tell us something useful about how often we're going to see, our typical, I guess I'll call everyday PRRS versus these emergence events that usually lead to more kind of widespread epidemic spreading. So I'm just going to take the last moment here and link this back to this original figure about PRRS evolution, just talk about some other work that we're doing in our group. We are trying to understand the role of vaccine use and immunity in general in terms of shaping evolution. Is the widespread use of vaccines actually drive viruses to evolve so that they're better at invading host immunity? We also are interested in using sequences to understand drivers between farm spread. That's an area we've been working in a while. We want to use these large-scale data sets that are available now for PRRS to try to actually, rather than just be reactive, but actually maybe be more proactive in terms of being able to anticipate the next big one. So what is the next big variant that might emerge that is going to, spread widely? And then lastly, we're doing a lot of work right now to try to predict the immunological differences between strains based on sequence data to give producers and veterinarians better tools that when they get these sequences from their on-farm management to actually be able to make better interpretations about whether one strain is going to provide protection for the herd against some other strain. And with that, I want to recognize my lab. That's, a key part of the work we do, as well as thank the organizers today and for inviting me, as well as for the AGREET program for creating the opportunity for me to work here at the University of Minnesota. And thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Thanks for sharing some of your work, using that data to better understand this like complex world of virus and pathogen movement and how that affects, Minnesotans in general who are maybe meat consumers, and getting a peek behind the scenes a little bit of swine production. So you guys, we've covered a lot of ground here today in a short period of time. Hopefully you've learned that AGREET touches a lot of topics across the U and across the state, and I'm hoping and sure that there's been some interest that's been piqued after hearing our speakers talk a little bit about their research. So at this point, we'll open it up for questions. We have some time to hear from the audience, so you can submit your questions via the chat, or you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask something directly to one of our speakers. So we do have one in the chat that we can start with, and that is from Marlis, another CFANS board member. So she's wondering if Dr. VanderWaal could tell us a bit about how the livestock and swine industry is working within the One Health effort, if there is a connection there, or what that might be.
I think I can tell you a little bit about. I'm not an expert in this area, and I feel like some of the other guests today work more actively in this sphere. And I think that there's probably two ways you could take this, right? One is One Health in the aspect of medicine, and that's human medicine and veterinary medicine in terms of shared diseases and shared health concerns, right? So that certainly is One Health, and there's a great deal of research right now, particularly on influenza viruses that are shared between swine and humans, and also birds. And so there's a lot of work right now about how often we see transmission occurring between pigs and humans, particularly, producers or people that actually, handling the animals. And then also not only quantifying how often this occurs, but what are the best mitigation tools that we can put in place on farms that could actually try to prevent this sort of transmission from occurring. Because I would think that everyone agrees that sharing viruses between pigs and humans is not good for either side. So there is work going on in that area. But then we also can think about One Health in terms of environmental health as well, and the impact of farming on sustainability and the environmental health of the area. And I think some of the other speakers that you heard from are much more in that sphere. So maybe I'll punt this question to one of them to jump in.
Yeah, I can add a little bit to that. I look at One Health very similarly to that word sustainability, where we are trying to balance, right, multiple impacts of an action or a system. And so, I look at it as like a stewardship. We can make choices and we can have impacts on human health, on animal health, on environmental health. And I have yet to see one action that can completely mitigate or completely improve all aspects or make every aspect better. But I like the word stewardship. Can we make informed choices, recognizing that one choice won't improve every single aspect of a system and or a pillar, similarly to sustainability, right? But can we be responsible for those choices and just recognize what those impacts are?
I think that's a great answer, Erin. And I think, Lindsay, one of your slides where you were showing, positives and negatives, and based on kind of your perspective or your vantage point or your goal, that those things can change, right? How you're looking at it. I actually had a question for Lindsay related to like the nutrient runoff piece. Do you find that fields in northern Minnesota, like the runoff coming off of those fields, are different than other parts? Have you done comparisons with other parts of the state just based on like crops that are being raised, management techniques, nitrogen being applied? Like how does it vary up there versus maybe down here in the Twin Cities or, southern Minnesota?
Yeah, and that's a really great question, Annie, and that's something that that I actually have been working on quite a bit, is looking at how, well, specifically when it comes not necessarily with nitrogen, but with phosphorus losses. Phosphorus losses are really tied to surface runoff and some a little bit more closely to some of those on-farm management practices. And what we see is that, I mean, a lot of the practices that farmers are doing are pretty similar across the state, but your weather has a huge impact on what actually is leaving your farm. And I think that is something that is really important to keep in mind, is that even when everyone is doing exactly what extension says are the best management practices, I think what we're seeing is that one 5-inch rainfall event can overwhelm most systems. So it actually, I think, has a lot more to do with you want to be you almost need some things happening at we call it at the edge of field, or some practices to kind of help catch those events, because the weather is going to overwhelm your system even if you're doing everything right. So but as far as differences in regions, I think the landscape makes a really big difference, and then in the water patterns. I'd say in Northwest Minnesota, all of the nutrients and all the water is moving like right now as things are melting. And then we see a lot less happening throughout the rest of the year. And we do get fewer of those like 4 or 5-inch rainfall events that I think have become more and increasingly occurring further south. And we're just kind of at the edge. We get a little bit less rainfall, and so we're getting a little bit less of that impact. So it really, I think it's kind of a long answer to your question, but yeah, we are seeing some differences, but there's a lot of factors involved.
Sure. Thank you for that. Anybody else have any questions out there in the audience? We've also got our interim deans still on here, our AGREET experts. Okay,
Can I jump in a little bit? And I just want to go back to the question in the chat about how the livestock swine industry is working within the One Health effort, because I believe there's still a lot of experience in the room that can talk about because not everything the livestock industry are doing is directly related with diseases only. There's also a lot of management, for example, of manure and waste products. And Erin can help some with that probably. And there's also a lot of working conditions and how the environment, for example, in the barn, and what are the concentrations of gases produces there. And then every time you walk into a barn, no matter what animals are there, you feel the smell, right? And how much we have to flow the air, and how we have to, what conditions we need to have healthy animals that at the end of the day are going to, the healthier the animal, the more, and Kim made a point about this, we don't want to lose animals in the production line, right? Because we don't want to have losses that at the end of the day mean an extra animal that didn't make it to market. And at the same time, you want to make sure that the people working in the farm is healthy and they're not suffering for any diseases or complications or just being under risk because of their working conditions. And then you have the downstream pieces that have to do with, well, now you have all the manure and all this waste that you have to work around, and they affect the environment. And at the end of the day, probably health down the road because of the leakage of water and things like that. So at the end of the day, every single point is connected. And I can go back to what we feed animals and where that feed comes from and how do we produce the soybeans and the corn and all the plants that at the end of the day end up here. So I think it was said before, there's not a single answer that fixes the whole thing, but the little pieces here and there is what at the end of the day makes everything work better. And I think what we probably want to start focusing on is how do we add on this little pieces? What we learn from Kim, what we learn from Lindsay, and what we learn from Erin and Jolene, that is also an AGREET faculty, to bring in and say, okay, we can do things better in a way that at the end of the day is going to make a better environment, a healthier human, but also healthier animals and healthier food.
Yeah, that all the decisions that farmers are making, that producers are making, have an impact, right? And maybe trying to understand what the impact is, or what has the greatest impact, and where can you make those, kind of prioritizing making those changes, right? Because that's going to change from farm to farm. It looked like the Buschettis might be looking to ask a question. Are you guys?
I have a question, I think, for Lindsay. There's a lot of farmers that have spread manure this winter, some on top of the snow cover. How much of that is being lost into the streams and to the water system?
Yeah, that is a good question. And I think we definitely don't encourage manure spreading on frozen ground. And Erin probably can take a crack at this question as well, because I know this is close to her area of expertise. But yeah, I mean, when you have manure spread on top of the frozen soil, there's nowhere for it to infiltrate down. It can't soak into the soil. So that is what we consider to be a very risky practice in terms of water quality, especially if you don't have something at the, to catch the nutrients, before they hit the stream. So I'll probably leave it with that unless Erin has more thoughts. Yeah,
that echoes what I've seen in some past projects looking at, can we measure this? And Lindsay made a big point about the weather, and that research project that I'm familiar with manure spreading and those impacts was heavily weather dependent. If there was a layer of ice underneath that manure, the risk was a lot higher for that runoff. If it was maybe frozen but no layer of ice, then the risk was lowered, and we can't predict all of those things on a year-to-year basis necessarily. So it is about how do we just simply manage risk, and as Lindsay said, we don't recommend it as a practice.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, I just want to say thank you. We've kind of reached the end of our Q&A timing here. So thank you so much to our speakers, taking the time out of your busy schedules to present to all of us here today. Thanks to everybody for attending. I'm just going to turn the program back to Mary.
Excuse me. Thank you, Annie. As we wrap up the program, I just want to recognize the CFANS Alumni Society Board for championing this program, which started, as I said, in 2002. And it's great to see several of our current and past board members that have joined us today. And I want to give a shout out to Annie Pease, who has been a champion from this program since she's joined the board. And as she mentioned early on, she continues to advocate for it and lead the planning, even as she is no longer serving on the board. Thank you to the speakers for sharing your research and insights with us, and the CFANS events person, the face behind the CFANS events label, Meredith Dwyer, who works the magic and provides our technical expertise for the day. And then before we transition into breakout rooms, we just wanted to remind you of a few upcoming opportunities to engage with the college. Borealis Night of Excellence is actually this Thursday. We have a busy alumni week celebrating students, alums, friends, faculty, staff, and their contributions and accomplishments with the college. If you haven't signed up to be a mentor yet, there's still time for to sign up to be a mentor for next fall. This year we had 103 undergrads, grad students, and postdocs matched with mentors, so spread the word. And finally, if you plan to come to the Great Minnesota Get Together, we hope you'll stop by the CFANS exhibit in the Ag Hort building at the State Fairgrounds. So that concludes our formal program for the afternoon.